Okay, so this is chapter 6 of the Bible and Gender on 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. This is written by Dr. G. Steve Kinnard, Dr. Glenn Giles, Valder Koa, Suzette Lewis, Kay McKean, Dr. Greg Moretsky, and Jeannie Shaw. Abstract. This paper is an exegesis of 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. The passage deals with the behavior and role of men and women in corporate worship. In the context of teaching in the church and to a broader degree in relation to ecclesial structure and authority in the early church. Paul encourages men to pray everywhere by lifting holy hands without a spirit of anger or discord. Paul encourages women to dress modestly and to have a spirit of quietness. Also, there is the much discussed passage where Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Paul states that his reasoning for this prohibition comes from the account of the order of creation and the story of the fall in Genesis. We will also consider what Paul meant when he stated that women will be saved through childbearing. Note on the exegetical approach. The exegesis of this passage follows the guidelines of the historical critical method, meaning the authors will explore matters of grammar, both lexicological and syntactical, and the historical, political, social, cultural background of the passage. Also, both the immediate and remote context of the passage will be considered. Finally, the passage will be viewed through a Christocentric lens. The goal is to discover what Paul meant when he wrote these words to Timothy almost 2,000 years ago. The authors of this paper believe that Paul was the author of 1 Timothy, and Paul was writing to his young prodigy Timothy, who was located in Ephesus at the time. The conduct of men and women. 2, verse 8 through 15. Kinnard's translation. Therefore, I wish that men should pray in every place, holding up holy hands without anger and argument. Likewise, women should adorn themselves in appropriate clothing with modesty and moderation, not with braided hair, gold ornaments, pearls, or expensive clothing, but what is fitting for women who profess godliness through good works. A woman must learn in quietness in all submission. I do not permit a woman to teach, neither to exercise authority over a man, but to remain in quietness. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. But she will be saved through childbearing, if they remain in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. NIV 1984. I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands in prayer without anger or disputing. I also want women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Introduction. As authors, we would like to know, when you open this book, did you skip through the pages to find this particular passage to see what we as teachers had to say about these verses? If you did, we can't blame you. This is one of those controversial passages that demand our attention. In fact, Knut Larson writes about this passage, noting, this chapter also contains one of the most controversial verses in the Bible about the place of women in the church. There are many ways to understand this. Ask for wisdom as you study the chapter and for grace toward others who may disagree with the conclusion that becomes your conviction. That's good advice. This is a difficult passage. We should study to understand it, but we should be careful about being too dogmatic. Humility should be our guide in our study and our discussion of these verses. What is the historical setting here? The setting is the public assembly of the church in Ephesus. The setting includes times where the teaching of Scripture and doctrine occurred in the local assembly of the church. And when you consider that the passage continues directly into the appointing of elders in chapter 4, the broader context is the consideration of the ecclesiastical structure in the church. When the church assembled together in Ephesus, something was out of step. Paul addresses that concern here. First, we will consider background material. Second, we will look at what Paul has to say to Timothy concerning the men of the church in Ephesus. Third, we will explore Paul's comments to Timothy concerning the women in the church there. Timothy in Ephesus, the historical, cultural, sociological, archaeological, and geopolitical background. Ephesus was a huge cosmopolitan city located in Asia Minor, modern Turkey. It was home to one of the wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis, Diana. Female priests officiated at this temple. Also, Ephesus had a wonderful library, so people would come to the city to worship and to study. Some of us have had the opportunity to visit the archaeological ruins of Ephesus. There is a section in Ephesus where the wealthy patrons lived. You can see the ancient frescoes that decorated their homes. They were very elaborate and ornate. Tour guides of the ancient city point out painted footprints that line the city pavement. These painted footprints led to the brothels and houses of prostitution. Guides also point out the public baths that the Romans made popular in Ephesus. Rome had a major influence on Ephesus. Rome controlled the city. One of the major influences that Rome had on the city was the introduction of the concept of the new Roman woman into the society there. Recently, biblical scholars have posited the theory that Paul's writing in 1 Timothy 2 reflects the emergence of the new Roman woman in the eastern part of the empire. Philip H. Towner defines and describes characteristics of this woman, writing, "She exercised freedoms and opportunities for participation in public life, political and legal activity, patron and benefactor roles that far exceeded those of the traditional Greek woman, who has long been the model drawn on by New Testament scholars. Moreover, the ancient evaluation of her patterns of dress and behavior locate her within something of an ancient sexual revolution." For those of us who lived through the 60s in the United States, we understand the concept of a sexual revolution with all the uninhibited freedoms that went along with this revolution. Ephesus was experiencing the same type of revolution in the 60s, but we're speaking about the 60s of the first century. The rulers of Rome were not happy with the changes that they saw occurring around the city. Winter writes, "Augustus and some of his successors used appearance and apparel to promote values to counter what they regarded as promiscuous tendencies in the empire. The introduction of permissive clothing and hairstyles explains why Paul specifically wrote against braided hair, gold ornaments, pearls, or expensive clothing. This was the style of the new Roman woman. The style lacked modesty, and modesty was to be a characteristic of the Christian woman. Thus, Paul directs Timothy to instruct the women in the church to dress modestly. This outward adorning of the body reflects the inner adorning of the heart. This new fashion style was one way for the new Roman woman to push against repressive boundaries. In general, the men of Rome had much more freedom than the women of Rome. Only men held public office. Ancient Athens and Rome developed the modern democratic society, but only men participated in this democratic society. Men attended the Roman baths, women didn't. Women did not have the same freedoms or opportunities as men. What was the philosophy behind the mindset of the new Roman woman? Towner writes, "Equally characteristic was the desire of influential women to acquire for themselves and enjoy the freedoms normally restricted to men, to explore multiple sexual liaisons in association with dinner parties and banquets. Pursuit of sexual freedom required remaining unencumbered with children, so the ancient discussion includes reference to the practices of contraception and abortion. What might appear less drastic were the desires of women to take active roles in public life, in legal contexts, sometimes functioning as advocates. But in some cases, this simply took the form of speaking up in the presence of men or husbands, offering opinions, teaching, and philosophizing, what has been termed the movement of the new Roman woman. Women began to push the boundaries of what was considered respectable behavior of the wife and mother by the elite of Roman society. The sociological change began in Rome and then headed east. Soon the fashion, styles, and thinking of the new Roman woman invaded Corinth and Ephesus. Towner writes, in urban context, such as Corinth and Ephesus, where wealthy women were numbered among church members, the new movement had apparently made inroads. Matters of dress and behavior of women in Pauline churches were therefore quite likely to have been influenced by the model of the new liberal woman. If the background proves sustainable, then we find Paul reacting to the trends in Corinth that threatened to link the gospel message with a rejection of all the old rules of modesty. This would effectively associate Christianity with immorality in a way that would thoroughly discredit the gospel. In reading chapter 2, we need to keep in mind this backdrop of the influence of the new Roman woman on society in the Eastern Roman Empire. The biggest question in 1 Timothy 2, and one of the biggest questions of hermeneutics, is what is cultural and what transcends culture? In verse 9, the idea that transcends culture is Paul's admonition that women should adorn themselves in appropriate clothing with modesty and moderation. This is the primary point that Paul is making in these verses. In Ephesus, immodest apparel would include braided hair, gold ornaments, pearls, or expensive clothing. However, those are cultural items. Notice he doesn't mention a veil covering. He does in 1 Corinthians 11. Why the difference? Perhaps this is because the cultural norms of Ephesus and Corinth were different. Expressions of modesty are different in different cultures. What transcends culture is for women and men to dress modestly and live modest lives within their culture. How that is achieved changes from culture to culture. In his list, Paul begins with braided hair. Towner writes, the term that means literally braiding refers to the complex and fancy styling of hair, plaiting and piling it on top of the head, preferred by fashionable women of a certain sort. This type of braiding was expensive. It was often accompanied by gold beads and pearls being braided into elaborate hairstyles. Next, Paul mentions gold ornaments and pearls. Winter notes, pearls could be another epitome for sumptuousness. Jewelry became emblematic of the shameful woman. Paul concludes his list by mentioning expensive clothes. Elaborate hairstyles, lavish jewelry, and expensive clothes were the hallmarks of the new Roman woman. The hallmark of the new Christian woman or wife was different. Instead of being adorned with expensive clothes, the new Christian woman was to adorn herself in good works. Good works, good deeds, were considered the fruit of a godly life. In every culture, Christian men and women must understand what is culturally appropriate and inappropriate, and they must act and dress accordingly. Consider 1 Peter 3:3-4. Peter addresses Christian wives in this passage. He writes, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. Instead, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. Peter is associated with Antioch. That is farther east than Ephesus. His main idea was that true beauty lies inside a person. in a gentle and quiet spirit. This idea transcends culture. However, he does mention three specific cultural items: braided hair, gold jewelry, and fine clothes. This list differs slightly from Paul's list in 1 Timothy 2. Paul includes pearls in his list. The fact that the two lists do not match exactly may demonstrate that the lists are cultural, not universal, transcultural. The universal idea expressed in both lists is that Christians should study their culture, determine what is modest and immodest, and act accordingly. Leah and Griffin write, although Paul discussed dress, his true emphasis was not merely that women should dress modestly, but that genuine ornamentation is not external at all and consists of an attitude of commitment to good works. In every culture, disciples of Jesus are to dress in a way that allows the inner beauty of their heart to demonstrate to the world that they love God and live their lives for his glory. Paul addresses the men, verse 8. Therefore, I wish that men should pray in every place, holding up holy hands without anger and argument. Paul addresses the men and then the women concerning worship. He has something to say to each group. To the men, Paul says that he wishes that the men would pray in every place. Wish carries with it an implication of expectation, bulimai. An alternate translation would be, I desire. In every place could mean every place of worship, and it is translated as such in the New Living Translation. Every place could refer to various house churches that met in Ephesus. Also, Paul could be expressing a broader idea here. He desires for men to pray everywhere. Whichever way it is taken, prayer is closely associated with worship. When men pray, they should hold up holy hands without an angry or contentious spirit. There appears to have been some type of strife occurring in the church in Ephesus. Whatever the problem was, Paul did not want the problem to enter the context of public worship. Instead, anger and arguments were to cease before corporate worship began. This passage reminds us of the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Matthew 5:23-24. Before we worship, we must check our attitude toward other people. If we need to be reconciled with another disciple before worship begins, then reconciliation precedes worship. Getting rid of this type of animosity would be symbolized by holy hands. Holding up holy hands also implies a purity for worship. This again underscores the fact that in 1 Timothy 2, the context is the corporate worship of the church. In this passage, we have to ask, what is cultural, and what transcends culture? Prayer transcends culture. It is universal. It can occur at any location and at any time. Worshiping God without anger transcends culture. We are to worship God and pray to God with the right attitude. However, holy hands could be cultural. How do we know that? The fact that this term is not understood in all cultures could indicate that it is cultural. Plus, not everyone can hold up holy hands. Some people don't have the use of their arms. Consider this. In Greek culture, it is an insult to show someone the palm of your hand. In that culture, you ought to think twice before you lift your hand to God. In first century Jewish culture, devout Jews washed their hands before prayer. They dried their hands by lifting them in the air and letting them drip dry. This still occurs in certain sects of Judaism. This was a way of showing God that they approached him with clean hands. Today, we can lift holy hands in prayer, but we can also lift up our hands in our hearts by having a pure heart when we approach God. The physical washing of the hands isn't as important as the spiritual washing of the heart. God wants us to approach him with a pure heart. Mounce summarizes this verse in his commentary on the pastoral epistles, writing, the imagery of osios krios, holy hands, comes from the Old Testament. Exodus chapter 30, 19 through 21, Psalm 24:4, Isaiah 1:15, and Isaiah 59:3, which requires that hands be ritually cleaned before approaching God. The cleansing later became moral. James 4:8, 1 Peter 3:7. Jesus himself insisted that reconciliation must precede worship. Matthew 5:23 through 24, 6:12, 14 through 15, and Mark 11:25. The topic of prayer does not arise again in this passage, showing that prayer is not the main concern. So what is the main concern? That is a literary device known as foreshadowing. Foreshadowing keeps the reader reading. Paul introduces other ideas concerning propriety and attitude in the assembly of disciples and public worship. So let's keep reading. Paul addresses the women, verse 9 and 10. Likewise, women should adorn themselves in appropriate clothing with modesty and moderation, not with braided hair, gold ornaments, pearls, or expensive clothing, but what is fitting for women who profess godliness through good works. Look at the section above entitled Historical, Cultural, Sociological, Archaeological, and Geopolitical Background for more information on these verses. Verse 11 through 14. A woman must learn in quietness, in all submission. I do not permit a woman to teach, neither to exercise authority over a man, but to remain in quietness. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. But she will be saved through childbearing, if they remain in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. This is an important passage. It is also a difficult one. It is the passage used most often to teach that women should not be in a position of ecclesiastical authority over men. Therefore, it is a highly controversial scripture. We need to answer some questions as we look at this passage. First, what was Paul saying to his original readers? How did Timothy understand the passage? Second, what part of the passage is cultural and should remain in its first century context, and what transcends culture and should be applied today? So let's explore this passage in order to understand what it says and what it doesn't say. Verse 11, a woman must learn in quietness, in all submission. Again, the context is the assembly of the church. In the assembly of believers, Paul wants the church environment to be conducive to learning. It seems that there was a problem with this in Ephesus and in Corinth. Therefore, Paul writes to young Timothy in order to instruct him in regard to how to make the environment of the assembly more conducive to learning. Paul wants women to be able to learn in the assembly. This stands in contrast to the Jewish temple setting in Jerusalem, where women were only allowed in the women's court, the outer court, and not in the inner court with the men. Many believe that this separation of the genders was also true in synagogue worship. It is still true in the Hasidic Jewish community and in other communities around the world. However, in the early church, men and women were together in worship, participating and sharing together. At least that seems to be the case. Some scholars believe that the church in Corinth was segregated and that men worshiped in one room and women in another room. This occurred because of the influence of Jewish Christians in that setting. However, most scholars believe that in Ephesus, the men and women assembled together. In that setting, women were to learn in quietness and submission. To learn in quietness and submission doesn't mean women must never talk or never say anything in the assembly. Some translations translate quietness, heskia, as silence, but quietness is a better translation. Paul isn't looking for an external response. Paul seeks for an internal, intrinsic quality to manifest itself. Thus, quietness is a better translation here. In this context, quietness connects with submission and points to an intrinsic definition of heskia. Quietness and submission are a matter of the heart. Paul wanted to make sure that the conditions of the assembly were conducive to learning so the women would have an opportunity to learn. He is especially concerned that the women were able to learn. This was a progressive thought in Paul's day. Paul says, let the women learn in quietness and submission. This is the way that men should learn as well. Anyone who is teachable should have a quiet and submissive heart. This allows the heart to be teachable. Verse 12, Paul moves to the next topic. He writes, I do not permit a woman to teach, neither to exercise authority over a man, but to remain in quietness. Volumes have been written about this verse. Paul states that women are not to teach men or to exercise authority over men. This applies directly to the assembly of the church, although given the broader context of the passage and how the passage leads into chapter 3 and the discussion of selecting elders, Paul could also have an ecclesiastical structure in mind. Perhaps Paul is continuing his earlier thought in verses 9 and 10, where he has the new Roman woman in mind. The new Roman woman was pushing the boundaries of the woman's role in society in an ungodly manner. Paul warns against the influence of this new Roman woman in the church. Paul Larson writes, it could be that as women experienced new freedoms within the Christian community, they began to throw off restraint. Their disagreements, questions, and assertions then became not a learning experience, but a disruption that worked against true worship. Paul did not want the women to be contentious. His main concern was the establishment of orderly worship. So Paul instructs Timothy that women are neither to teach nor to exercise authority over men. A big question is, what did Paul mean by exercise authority? The term exercise authority is extremely difficult to translate because the Greek word authenteo is a hapax legomenon, meaning it is used only once in the New Testament. Some scholars say the term carries with it a negative, even a hostile connotation of do not usurp authority, do not seize control. Thus, women can have authority over men in an ecclesiastical setting as long as they don't seize control. Other scholars view the term in a more general sense as do not have authority over. If the word is viewed in this way, then women are not allowed to have authority over men in any ecclesiastical setting. Scholarship is extremely divided over this issue, and there seems to be no way to reconcile the two camps. So we need to look at other passages for help here. The same dynamic that we see in Ephesus must have existed in Corinth. When Paul writes about the assembly of believers in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 14:33 through 35, he states, as in all the congregations of the saints, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. We know that in Corinth, women prayed and prophesied in the assembly, 1 Corinthians 11. Therefore, Paul is not talking about absolute silence. Women are allowed to participate in corporate worship. Perhaps Paul was prohibiting the taking over or the control of the worship of the church. In Paul's letter to Timothy, we learn that Paul did not permit the women to teach in the setting of corporate worship. However, this did not mean that women could not teach in the church. Women could be teachers, as older women were instructed to teach other women, Titus 2:3 through 5, as well as children, 2 Timothy 1:5. And in a team effort, Priscilla and Aquila taught Apollos, Acts 18:25 through 26. Anna was a prophetess, Luke 2:36 through 38, and Philip's daughters prophesied, Acts 21:9. However, Paul was clear to Timothy that women were not to teach men or to exercise authority in the ecclesiastical context. What type of teaching is Paul talking about here? It must be something other than praying and prophesying, because he allowed women to pray and prophesy in the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 14. Teaching here seems to be a more authorized and ecclesiastical type of teaching within the church. Throughout the letter, teaching is paired with command and teach and urge and teach. Also, the letter is filled with matters of doctrine and doctrinal concerns. Leah and Griffin proposed teaching involved official doctrinal instruction in the scriptures, 1 Timothy 5:17, and was a task delegated to the pastor teacher, Ephesians 4:11. The heavy emphasis in the pastorals on proper doctrine, 1 Timothy 1:10, 4 verse 6, 4 verse 13, 4 verse 16, chapter 6 verse 1, and chapter 6 verse 3. It implies the need for a trusted source of doctrine. Understanding Paul's instruction to Timothy regarding women, we go to the question that must be asked for us today. What instructions here were specifically cultural, and what part of these instructions transcends culture? Clearly, those women in Timothy's ministry were not permitted to hold ecclesiastical authority. And is that an instruction for us today? Could this be because women were not taught? We do not know the answers to these questions. Just as we view the prohibition of jewelry as a cultural phenomenon, understanding the circumstances of Paul's particular audience, can we likewise recognize the prohibition of women teaching men in a cultural sense? Or do we see that as a command for all time? Clearly, Paul's intention was not to exclude women from using their gifts and abilities in the context of the corporate church meeting. However, the universal principles that we can apply have to do with decorum and demeanor. No woman, or man for that matter, should take it upon himself or herself to usurp authority or have a domineering manner. And it seems that in the setting that Paul is addressing, the women were more likely to be guilty of this act. 21st century readers of Scripture can learn from these passages and apply them in our present day situations. In our interpretation, Paul teaches that men and women have different offices in the ministry. Both men and women can use their God-given gifts of leadership, encouragement, prophecy, teaching, and serving in the ministry. How then do we interpret Paul's exhortation about the women as it segues into his example that goes back to creation? Verse 13 and 14. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. The word gar is used in this context to express cause or reason. For this context, it is more likely that Paul is stating the reason for the prohibition, not the cause. Paul now gives the reason for his previous comments. Paul undergirds his teaching by reaching all the way back to the created order of things. George W. Knight notes, ground for the prohibition is now given. It is the order of the creation of Adam and Eve as the archetypes of man and women, and the implication of this order for headship and submission in such relationships. Other scholars note Paul's rabbinical training and the heresies promoted in Ephesus to explain his reasoning. Paul's not saying that Adam, man, was not guilty of transgression in the fall. He states Adam's guilt in Romans 5:12. His sin was more egregious since he sinned with his eyes wide open. However, Paul is citing these references in Genesis to give the reason behind what he is saying to Timothy in this epistle. Notice that Paul does not just reference the fall in his argument, but he also references the created order before the fall. Verse 15. But she will be saved through childbearing, if they remain in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. There are several ways to understand this verse. First, taken literally, when a woman bears a child, the act of childbearing saves her. There are at least two reasons to reject this interpretation. One, it is inconsistent with other scriptures that teach that we are not saved by works. Two, it is not possible for some women to have children. Since God wants all people to be saved, he cannot be saying that for a woman to be saved, she must bear a child. Second, in the Greco-Roman world of the first century, when women gave birth, there was a high risk that the mother would die in the process of childbirth. Women were often married at 14 or 15, and they became pregnant immediately after their marriage. Their bodies were not ready to have a child. So, to salve their fears of dying during childbirth. The women of Ephesus would sometimes turn to the temple of Artemis for comfort and assurance. Paul connects safety in bearing children with remaining faithful to Jesus. He is exhorting the female disciples in Ephesus not to turn to Artemis, but to turn to Jesus, or better, to stick with Jesus. Paul says, remain in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Third, consider the whole passage and consider the wider context. One of the differences between men and women is that women can have children and men can't. Paul is possibly speaking of women being willing to accept their role of being wives and mothers, as they should accept their role with quietness and submission. This is a matter of the heart. It is an inner attitude. Thus it becomes a matter of salvation. Women are to accept their role and remain in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Fourth, we take this verse as referring to the bearing of the child, Jesus. The verse refers to Mary's humble act of submission and the fact that Jesus came into the world because she submitted to God's will. Taken this way, salvation comes into the world through the act of the childbearing, the act of Jesus coming into the world. Paul goes on to and describes the leadership roles in the church more specifically in the next chapter. In the original text, there would be no chapter markers. This passage would flow right into the passage on elders, the ecclesiastical hierarchy and authority of the early church. In this section of the letter, Paul writes about leadership roles within the church, and he is answering a problem that arose in the worship and teaching ministry in Ephesus. Okay, that's the end of chapter 6. We'll be back with chapter 7 next week.